Hey guys.
Hey everybody.
Welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor weekly video. Tonight we're going to be talking about discrimination in the travel healthcare community. This is something that we have reached out to a lot of travelers to talk to this past week about their experiences. We want to share with you guys some of what we've learned and kind of just have a platform for discussion. Some of the issues that come up as a traveling healthcare professional and some of the ways that people approach this difficult topic when they're traveling, and some suggestions that we have that hopefully can help with this. So Whitney's going to introduce us and then we'll jump into the topic.
All right, hey everybody. Many of you guys may have tuned in the past for our videos and you may know us already, but for those that do not, my name is Whitney Aiken.
And I'm Jared Cazazza.
And we are both traveling doctors of physical therapy. We've been traveling physical therapists for about 5 years now. We run the website and the social media account Travel Therapy Mentor, and we also have a personal blog called Fifth Wheel PT. So each week we try to bring you various topics pertaining to travel therapists, everything from the actual logistics of being a travel therapist to the different lifestyle factors that affect us within our community of healthcare providers who choose to go on the road to be travelers. So this is not a topic that we've discussed before, but it is definitely a topic that is important. It's a topic that's ever present in our society and among our community, is kind of some of the discriminations and disparities that we face and that some of our colleagues face when we do decide to go on the road. And kind of, as a travel therapist, inherently, you take yourself out of your home community, maybe your bubble where you feel comfortable, and you insert yourself into a new community where you go to serve and provide healthcare services. But that opens you up to the potential to have a lot of discrimination against you. And this topic is not unique, discrimination on the basis of race and other factors, of course, is not unique to healthcare providers, and it's not unique to travel healthcare providers. But because this is our audience, this is our wheelhouse, we want to talk about it in terms of, the ways that it affects us and the ways that it affects us uniquely, because we kind of put ourselves out there and go to all these different communities. And we face a lot of unique situations because of that. So again, we kind of want to provide a platform just to have a conversation about this. We definitely recognize, our limitations to our own personal experience, our own personal perspective, which is why we went out of the way to really interview and ask for the perspectives of our colleagues across the country. So we talked to people from all over the country, different therapists of different racial backgrounds, different sexual orientations, different cultures, and that sort of thing, so that we could get a variety of experience. And hopefully tonight we can kind of bring that summary to you guys in a well-rounded way. So just to shed some light on the issues that exist and to talk about some of the suggestions that we've brainstormed and that we've talked to our colleagues about as in regards to how we can move forward as a travel healthcare community and try to improve the situation. Yeah,
and any of you guys watching, if you have experience with this, if any discrimination issues that you've run into, share that with us. We want to hear stories, your experiences, so let us know.
Okay. Thank you guys that are joining on live. Hey George, hey Nikki, hey Veronica. Veronica says, glad you're having this conversation. We appreciate it, Veronica. I know I got some insight from Nikki earlier and some of our other colleagues, so really appreciate you guys tuning in. Again, please let us know if you have feedback as we go through this. We're going to try to see if we can provide a thorough summary and just shed some light on these issues. And we definitely want it to be a suggestion, not a suggestion, a discussion. Yeah, an interactive discussion. We want to hear from you guys. We'll go through a few things, a few comments as we go along, and then we'll definitely save some of the comments for the end as well. So we kind of want to start with, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. I wanted to break it down and make it a cohesive kind of presentation. So the first part we're going to talk about are the issues, and then like Jared said, we're going to talk about some specific ways that other travelers said that they handled some of these issues, like interpersonal issues, and then the last thing we'll talk about is suggestions on how we can move forward. So Jared, if you want to start with just some of the issues of discrimination that we've heard about.
Yeah, so there's a variety of discrimination that happens, obviously, like Whitney said, throughout the whole world, our community, the whole world. We're trying to focus specifically on travel healthcare, like she said, because that's kind of our focus. And we've heard from a variety of people that there's discrimination based on age, sex, racial background, basic sexual orientation. So there's discrimination for a variety of different things that happens with travel healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
We've experienced this kind of, I guess, thinking at some of our assignments. So we primarily travel to rural areas, and it just so happens that a lot of these rural areas are kind of behind the times, it seems, with a lot of their ideas on inclusivity and just differences among people and being open and accepting of those things. So we have definitely run into situations where we have heard people make comments about race or about sexual orientation and those kind of things.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think it's no secret that there's certain parts of our country, certain members of our society that are less diverse, less open to diversity. And that becomes very apparent, like Jared said, when we travel to new places and, we immerse ourselves in a new culture. So we've definitely seen it. We have been pretty fortunate that we, being of a majority group when it comes to race, to sexual orientation, we have not been the subjects of a lot of discrimination. Now, there's been mild times where we felt like outcasts because maybe we were just in a different part of the country that we weren't from. Inherently, I think as a travel therapist, you're a little bit of an outsider, in a lot of ways, but we definitely haven't experienced some of the overt discrimination that we gathered in a lot of anecdotal stories. So again, we're going to kind of summarize just some of the anecdotes, some of the issues that we've talked to our colleagues about when it comes to the discrimination they've faced based on race, sexual orientation, and other factors.
Yeah, and this happens from patients. We've heard a ton of stories. A lot of patients tend to be older, and it seems that the older generation is a little less inclusive as well as the rural communities. And so patients making comments, colleagues, as well as even management in some cases, making comments about someone's race or gender identity and those kind of things.
Yeah, so that's a big issue that, we've heard that therapists and other healthcare providers experience within the workplace is just discrimination from their colleagues, from their patients, and sometimes from the management level. In general, we've definitely heard the sentiment that a lot of therapists, especially we heard this from a lot of people of color, that they just don't feel safe or they don't feel welcome in certain parts of the country. And because of that, we've heard a lot of travel therapists unfortunately say there's just parts of the country or certain types of regions that they don't feel comfortable traveling to and they won't take assignments there.
Yeah.
So that's a big issue that a lot of travel therapists and travel healthcare providers are facing.
Now, something we did learn through some of the research and some of the people that we talked to preparing for this video is how little diversity there is in healthcare in general, like healthcare practitioners. So we realized that the majority of physical therapists seem to be white. We didn't realize that 85% of PTs and OTs are white. And speech therapy is even higher than that. The statistic we saw was 92% are white. So obviously, minorities in healthcare are very underrepresented.
Yeah, and a lot of the feedback we got, some people kind of started to talk a little bit in the realm of like the healthcare disparities, like in terms of our patients, and that is like a whole nother issue that we definitely recognize, but is not the topic of tonight's discussion. Our audience is that of healthcare providers, so we want to bring you guys just some of the topics that face healthcare providers. So we do recognize there's a lot of health disparities among racial differences, socioeconomic difference for our patients, but we want to talk mostly tonight about the issues that face our providers. So yeah, we did see there's a huge disparity in the racial makeup and demographics of our professions, which really makes an impact on diversity within our profession. That's an issue because if people aren't seeing diversity within our profession and it's dominated by white people, then that could host certain problems in terms of discrimination because we're a majority white profession in PT, OT, and speech.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast a couple weeks ago and it was talking about, it was a good podcast. It's called Hidden Brain. If you guys don't listen to it, it's an NPR podcast. It's really good. They were talking about how there are studies showing that patients respond differently to people of different races. And pretty much what they were saying is that people respond better to people that they can relate to, which means that maybe a black patient doesn't respond as well to a white practitioner as they would to a black practitioner. So if these minority groups are underrepresented in the healthcare professional world, then that can lead to worse outcomes for those minority communities as well, which is something that we need to think about.
Yeah, so a lack of diversity among our healthcare professions causes difficulties and problems with our patient to provider interactions, but it can also cause problems with our provider to provider issues. I mean, if you're one person in the clinic is a minority and the rest are of the majority group in terms of race or sexual orientation and so forth, I mean, it's going to cause problems because you have no diversity there. Maybe your colleagues aren't aware of the issues that you face if you're the only one in the clinic who is of a minority background. Or, I mean, how many clinics out there are just completely white and then don't understand the issues that are faced by colleagues in other buildings and other locations? So for a multitude of reasons, not having diversity in our professions is a problem.
Yeah, and in terms of discrimination, it's not just overt racism that that practitioners run into, especially travelers that go into a brand new environment. It can be small little comments, or even just being treated differently than the other staff there or the patients there. Or we've heard from a lot of people that it's not that it doesn't happen overtly, but it's usually not as common as just not feeling as welcome for being different.
Yeah, and I mean, racism is definitely a big part of it, but also just other factors. You know, if someone is not sensitive to the issues that someone of a different sexual orientation face, or a different gender identity, someone from the LGBTQ community, someone who's trans, sexual, all those types of things, they might not be overtly discriminatory towards them, but there could definitely be, I think a buzzword right now is microaggressions, subtle comments or subtle behaviors, stereotypes, things that maybe somebody who's white or somebody who's of the majority group just doesn't even realize that they're being discriminatory when they might be. So we've definitely heard that sentiment when interviewing and asking our colleagues of these minority groups what they've experienced. The other thing is just one of the issues is kind of just a lack of awareness. We definitely heard the sentiment that people felt like there was a lack of awareness, there was a lack of acknowledgement of these issues, of the lack of diversity, just nobody's talking about it. So, I mean, that's one big reason why we wanted to talk about it tonight. Again, like we mentioned, we are definitely limited to our experience, to our perspective. I mean, I don't think, unless you're completely colorblind, you can see that we're white, we are heterosexual. We do want to be a voice here and provide a platform, even from our perspective, and that's why we went out of our way to gather other people's perspectives. But we want to be a voice to acknowledge it, because a lot of people just feel like it's not being acknowledged, it's not being talked about.
And in terms of travel too, I guess it's important to mention, along with these issues, this is not just a U.S. thing. We've traveled a lot internationally, as most of you guys know, and in Asia, we heard from some minority groups there, so especially darker skinned people. The Asian people can be, at least in Thailand and parts of Cambodia, we heard from those people that Asian people can be very discriminatory against them. So this is not just a US thing, it's kind of worldwide.
Well, I mean, we also talked to some of our colleagues who were of other minority groups, not just talking about African American, but maybe Asian American groups that are actually mentioning that there is discrimination within their own culture for people that have darker hues of skin tone. So there's definitely a lot of issues, and I think it's important that we put it out there. It's important that we talk about it. I mean, when you're talking about any issue, it's important just to acknowledge that there is a problem, so then we can kind of work past that and say, okay, there is a problem, now what can we do about it, which is kind of one of the next things that we're going to talk about.
And along with that, in Asia, we were very surprised to find out that there is a lot of value put on having lighter skin there. So like Whitney said, there's some discrimination there against other Asian people with darker skin, and they go so far as to use almost all their products are skin whitening products. So there's like skin whitening body wash and lotion, and it's hard to find things that aren't skin whitening. We're in the store trying to find stuff that's not skin whitening. So there's just a lot of discrimination around the world of people with darker skin.
Yeah. So again, one of the issues that the sentiments that were expressed to us were that there's a lack of acknowledgement, and then they were also saying, a lot of people were saying there was a lack of people from the majority group, in instances, if we're talking about racism, a lack of people that are white speaking up about it, a lack of people that are white or heterosexual or whatever the majority group is standing up for them in these instances that they felt discriminated against or faced discrimination. We heard lots of anecdotes about people, maybe a patient said something racist towards them or a colleague, and no one else in the room stood up for them. No one said anything, no one did anything, and this is wrong, and we definitely want to point that out, and we want to work towards how we can improve that among our colleagues. So those are just some of the various issues of discrimination that we have gathered and heard from. Again, if you guys are watching, whether you're watching live or you're watching later, please let us know if you have any input on something that we didn't cover in terms of the issues of discrimination and lack of diversity that exist for healthcare providers, and specifically travel healthcare providers. We're definitely here to listen and to learn from you guys. So the next part that we want to talk about is just some ways that our colleagues said that they have handled some of these situations. So the first part I want to talk about is the way that they've said that they handle some issues that they were faced with when they were going to new places.
Yeah, and like Whitney mentioned earlier, we've talked to several people that just won't go to certain regions of the U.S. or certain areas depending on what the makeup of that community is. So for the most part, this was Black therapists that didn't want to go to the South because of racial biases there, and a lot of the South in reality, and as well as some parts of maybe the Northeast or some areas that are not as inclusive.
Or just rural areas in general. And it wasn't exclusive to just our friends and our colleagues that were persons of color. We definitely heard it from the LGBTQ community as well, that some of them didn't feel comfortable going to some of the more rural areas where they might not be as welcoming. So sadly, that was their solution. You know, they said, we're not going to change the attitudes and culture of an entire region overnight. I mean, it's a global problem. It's a nationwide problem. They can't just change it. So they said their answer to that was just to avoid it.
Yeah, in some cases it is very ingrained in these communities, and it's it's been this way for forever there, and it is hard to change. So yeah, some people choose to just avoid those areas completely.
Yeah. Another solution that they said is some people have chose to ask specific questions during a phone interview. Now, I definitely think that some of the people that I spoke to that said this were more outgoing, were more forward about these types of things, and they definitely acknowledge that not everyone is. So for example, I had someone that I spoke with who was from the LGBTQ community say that they will sometimes fill out the interview and explicitly ask, you know, what are their policies in terms of discrimination? And one therapist told me that she did an interview recently with a clinic who expressed that they were a faith-based clinic. And to her, that was kind of a red flag, and it caused her to, in turn, ask a question and actually state overtly that she was a lesbian and if that was going to be a problem. And she really acknowledged that, like, for a lot of people, you might be scared to say something like that, or you might not want to say something like that. But for her, she felt like she would rather put it out there than move all the way somewhere and be in a bad situation. So, and again, I don't know if that's something that persons of color would want to go out of their way to say, but some people might. That was the way that some people choose to handle that.
Yeah, some other therapists also mentioned that they will research the area, the demographics, the crime rates, those kind of things to look for any red flags there. We have done this in the past as well. We will research crime rates before we go to any place. We've turned down jobs simply based on the crime rate there. So that kind of applies to everybody, but it might apply even more to certain groups.
Yep. We also heard people express that sometimes when they were looking for housing as a travel therapist, they would go out of their way to discuss with the person who was offering the housing, especially if it was going to be a roommate situation, someone they would actually live with. If they felt like it would make a difference, to let them know that they were, for example, gay, or let them know what their race was, if they felt like it could cause potential problems. Now, I mean, it's very individual choice. I think a lot of people wouldn't feel that it was necessary to say that, but there are certain people that are of these minority groups that feel like if they could potentially be getting into an unsafe or an uncomfortable position if the roommate or the landlord didn't know that they were gay, or didn't know that they were black, or didn't know that they were blank, they would rather just say it up front and find out on the phone before they would move all the way there and set up housing and have it become an issue.
Yeah, and another thing that people choose to do is if there's an area that they're unsure about, they can use Facebook groups or different social media platforms to reach out to others that may have worked in that area, other travelers. That's a great thing about having the community that we do. We talk to people that have been to the same areas that we're looking for jobs and see what their experience was. So there are a lot of people of color that will reach out to other people and ask, is this an area that is pretty tolerant and inclusive, or is this kind of a place that's still kind of stuck back in the old days?
Yeah. So those are some of the sentiments and information that we heard from people who specifically talking about moving to a new area as a travel therapist. The other thing that we heard about was just ways that some people of minority groups choose to handle when they experience discrimination, how they handle it in the workplace. And this would apply to all healthcare providers, not just travel therapists, not just travel healthcare providers, but say, for example, they were working with a patient or a colleague who made an explicit racist or bigoted comment towards them. How did they handle that? Of course, I think it kind of depends on the situation. You know, some people say that they try to just brush it under the rug, you know, ignore it. Some people, depending on the situation, might stand up a little bit more about it. We definitely also heard from some people that maybe in their conversations with patients, like they just weren't so open about sharing about their personal life. Just to kind of avoid confrontation. I definitely heard that from people of the LGBTQ community. Some people even went so far as to say that they would just lie to their patients if it came up about their sexual orientation because they just didn't want to go there, or that they would just omit information. I definitely think that, you know, I couldn't necessarily relate to it in terms of the sexual orientation factor, but we could relate to it when it comes to like the religion factor.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of therapists have had the same experience.
Working in a lot of these rural areas that we do, there's usually a very strong religious community there. Whitney and I are not particularly religious. So there's been situations where people will say, what church do you go to? And we will just try to divert that conversation. So we can understand a little bit on that front. It's not always easy to go into a discussion about things like sexual orientation with patients. And sometimes it's just easier to try to change the subject.
And it's sad that to know that we have to do that, but you also just have to understand that in order to treat a patient, you don't necessarily have to agree on all fronts. And I think that a lot of our patients, we come into a community that may be more homogenous, and they probably don't even realize that they're being offensive by asking you something because they just assume maybe you're going to agree with them on the front of religion or sexual orientation or whatever it might be, politics, whatever, and they might not even realize that they're being a microaggressive or whatever it might be by asking you certain things. So for you, knowing what you know in your head, you might just find it easier just to avoid those conversations.
Yeah, some might not realize they're doing it, but some patients also will purposely be kind of confrontational with you and just see how you respond to it. And that's something that we've definitely experienced as well.
Yeah, and sadly, it's not always patients. I mean, it definitely happens with colleagues sometimes, and it's very unfortunate. We would hope that our peers, our colleagues, our fellow healthcare professionals who are educated would, and you know, it's not like a patient who might have a cognitive problem, someone who has what's the word I'm looking for, not amnesia, but dementia. It's not like your colleagues have dementia. It's not like your colleagues should have social filters and should be educated, but unfortunately they don't all. So it happens. So those are some ways that we heard from our colleagues and our friends about ways that they might handle certain situations in the clinic. Now, the next thing we want to talk about are just some general suggestions that we have come up with, as well as we've heard from others, on how we as healthcare professionals can help, move forward in a positive light, help improve some of these issues, help reduce discrimination in our workplace and in the communities that we serve.
Yeah, one of the most important things that we heard and that we agree with for sure is that we all need to be able to realize our own biases and our own privileges as whatever group we are, like whatever, however, I guess, especially in a majority group, we need to realize the privileges that we have. And in terms of biases, a lot of people think of racism or discrimination against any group as something that is very overt, like we were talking about. But in reality, everyone has biases, and sometimes you don't even realize that. And there's tons of studies showing this, how people will act differently based on the color of the skin of the person that they're talking to, or things like applications with different names that might indicate a certain race, how people respond differently to wanting to interview that person. So this is something that everyone has some implicit bias, so being mindful of that is very important.
Yeah, I think another important suggestion that we heard and that we agree with is it's important to educate ourselves in regards to issues of diversity and discrimination. Like we talked about earlier, we definitely recognized that, like the PT profession, for example, that our colleagues and our classmates and everything are majority white, but when we really saw the statistic that it was over 85%, that was really eye-opening.
Yeah.
So just educating, watching this video is a good start. Talking to your friends, talking to your colleagues, talking to people who are of other different cultural backgrounds than you. Go out of your way to research these things, to educate yourself, because it just starts with knowledge and accepting some of these facts within yourself, within ourselves. I mean, this has been really a journey this past week when I was researching this topic, going out of my way to interview some of my friends and colleagues about their experiences. It's been very eye-opening. It's definitely caused a lot of self-reflection on my part. It's caused me to evaluate my biases, and I think that's something that we should all do, and it's important to move forward as an educated group of individuals within our profession.
Yeah, and we can't be afraid to speak up on behalf of if you're in a situation, especially for like our situation where we're going into an area that is very homogenous, and that they might make comments that maybe they don't even realize are racist comments, to be able to stand up for the minority groups and say things like, that's not really a good thing to say, or, because sometimes they really don't understand. Like some of these communities are way back in the past and they don't understand these kind of things.
Yeah. So I think that was a huge call to action, because I didn't want to just, when I was interviewing my friends and my colleagues from different backgrounds, I didn't just want them to tell me what the problem was. I wanted them to help me to bring together a cohesive argument of actionable steps that we could take. And I think a huge call to action was for everyone to speak up, especially people who are white, people who are of a majority group, to not only just be silent, be passive. I think a big call to action right now is to be openly anti-racist or openly anti-discriminatory. And I don't think that's always easy, but it is the right thing to do. And I do think that we are in a unique position as traveling healthcare professionals where we are, for a short time, inserting ourselves into a community. I don't think it's easy to stand out, because even like I said with Jared and I, like if we go to a new clinic and say we're white and say the majority of the people there are white, you might think, well, we're just automatically part of the crew, but it's not always the case. A lot of times we are still looked at as an outsider. We're still some just travel therapist that's there for 13 weeks. We're not from their community. We're not in their clique. So there is definitely it's like you're almost inclined to just want to try to skirt below the radar, fit in, not cause ripples, not cause waves. You want to try to fit in for those 13 weeks. So if you're somewhere and you hear somebody say something racist, or you hear somebody say something against another minority group based on sex or sexual orientation or whatever it might be, it's easy to not say anything. It's easy just to pretend like you didn't hear it, laugh it off, forget about it. It's hard. It's the hard thing to do, to stand up and say, hey, that's not really right, that's not really funny, you shouldn't say that. And I think it's in our nature to just try to just skirt under the radar and not do it. But I think the call to action is, and something that's very important for us to try to do, is to speak up, is to be a voice, even if it's not affecting us, even if it wasn't a discriminatory or derogatory comment towards us or our group or whatever. I think it's really important. And one thing that kind of, along with this, that someone said to me in my interviewing of my colleagues, was they think that it was really important, say that the person who's making a bigoted or derogatory remark is, say we were in the room and it was a white heterosexual male. If they are a white heterosexual male or whatever it might be making the comment, they might not respond as well to criticism from someone of the group that they were being derogatory towards. Say if they made a racist comment about a black person and then the black person says to them, that's not right, you shouldn't say that. But if someone who looks like them, someone who they feel is of their group, for example, if Jared was in the room and he was also a white heterosexual male, if Jared says that's wrong, that might really be eye-opening to the individual who said it, because they're seeing someone who's of their own group, if you will, speak out against it. And I do think it's really important in that regard.
Yeah, I think definitely we've run into situations where, especially in these smaller communities, they just feel like everyone that looks like them has the same ideas that they have. So if you don't go out of your way to say something, to say, no, that's not right, then they might feel like, oh yeah, they feel the same way as me and everyone here feels the same way and it's no big deal.
Yeah, so I think that's something really important and a really important call to action for all of us as therapists is no matter if the derogatory comments or discrimination affects us directly, we should all feel as though we need to speak up about it to try to move our profession and our world forward and reduce discrimination. The other thing is, I think it's very important that we as travel healthcare providers try to be sensitive and welcoming of cultural diversity. And I think for the most part we are. Like, we're the type of people who choose to move somewhere new, to have a new experience, to go to a new community. So I would hope that the majority of us are open to cultural diversity and open and inclusive. But it's just even more important to underline.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about going to meetups with other travelers or the Travelers Conference is you meet so many cool people that are inclusive. They don't care what you look like. They don't care your orientation or anything like that. I think to be a traveler, you have to be kind of adventurous and inclusive. I think that's kind of intrinsic qualities for a lot of us.
Yeah, and I mean, we're just in a unique position to make a difference. You know, as I said, we kind of are in a unique position to go into a community. And I know someone I spoke with earlier, our friend Veronica, said, it might not be easy for you to be the one in the clinic who speaks out, but you might be the only one who's an outsider that ever comes into their clinic, that's ever a voice of something other than their deeply ingrained beliefs. So there might not be another person to speak up. It might be you, and so it might not be easy, but I think that it is important.
Very, very important.
Another call to action and an important suggestion that we heard was that we as social media leaders and other social media leaders that are out there, someone who is an admin of a group or has a platform or has a blog, just to say and let it be known that it's okay for people of minority groups to use their voice to speak up about issues. And we definitely want to openly say that in the groups that we admin and in our community, we are more than welcoming of your voices in any issue that you're facing. I mean, I want you to post in our groups about questions about housing and questions about taxes and questions about pay and definitely questions about diversity. Something that was specifically mentioned was, like we talked about earlier, how some therapists might not feel comfortable to go to certain areas. Use those groups, use our groups, use the other travel therapy groups to ask your colleagues, ask your friends, crowdsource, say, hey, I'm going to this part, or I have a job offer in this area of the country. Is there anyone who's been there that could talk to me about the cultural diversity of that area? Is there, if it's something you're specifically concerned about, if you're a person of color, is there another person of color in here that I could talk to who's also been there? Is that a safe place for me to go? Did you feel comfortable? If you're a member of the LGBTQ community, is there another person of the LGBT community in here I could talk to? Please discuss those things. Like, those are really important topics, and we openly invite you to discuss them.
For sure. One other thing we want to talk about is various organizations, so like the APTA, AOTA, and ASHA, and how we can get involved in those organizations to promote diversity and see what their policies are on various things.
Yeah, so that was definitely a common thread that came up, is like, what are some actionable steps that we can take? A lot of what we've talked about is kind of on the personal level, and that's very important for us to evaluate ourselves on a personal level, but what can we do at an organizational level? Some things that I looked into this week that I honestly hadn't looked into before and I need to look into more are, what are some of the bills and the legislation that are going on within our groups and our organizations? For example, I saw that there was a legislation trying to be passed that was backed by the APTA to try to get more grants and scholarships to certain communities that were socioeconomically disadvantaged, to try to help them economically or financially, try to be able to apply to physical therapy school or be able to get into physical therapy school, so that we could promote more diversity and basically decrease the barriers to certain groups being able to get into school. So just as an example, that is one type of legislation that is out there. So I think it's important for us all as healthcare providers to get involved in our organizations, to find out what kind of stances they're taking on discrimination, on diversity within our professions, and get involved with those legislations and bills.
Yeah, that's something Whitney and we need to be better about that with, because we are not very involved with the APTA at all. We don't pay much attention to what's going on there for any issues, but that is definitely an important thing that we need to do better on.
And not just, I mean, I definitely want to talk about the APTA and the organizations, but it also really brought to light that just on a political stance, like, a lot of people say, well, how can you get involved? Vote, vote for your local committee members and representatives within your community, not just participate in the presidential election, but participate in your local community elections too. We have never done that. And I think a big thing has been, especially for me, say I was in high school and then I went to college somewhere else and I went to grad school somewhere else. And then I became a travel therapist. So I have never, not once, ever considered what is going on in my local community back home, where we actually now just bought a house. So we really are part of this community. And I think that that's something that I'm like, why have I not gotten involved ever?
Well, and for us, I mean, and all travelers, probably all you guys watching, it is difficult to feel like you're a part of just one community because we move so often.
I think that's something that just really my eyes were open to recently. And I think that's probably something that a lot of you guys can relate to, is like we move around so much. It's like, which community are we involved in? So even if you don't feel like you're involved in your home community, wherever you keep your tax home or whatever, we can definitely look at it as like being involved in our community organization, our APTA, our AOTA, our ASHA community. We can look at it as being involved together in our travel therapy community. What can we do to make differences there? But just some ideas, just some suggestions to get you guys thinking the way that our eyes have been open to recently as well.
All right, so now we want to talk about travel companies and recruiters and some considerations there in terms of discrimination, diversity, and what we can do, what we can ask.
Yeah, so some calls to action that were made. One I forgot to mention was, in addition to being involved in your organization, would be maybe to write to your organization to specifically ask them, what are you doing to promote diversity? Now you could also, if you feel compelled, write to your travel companies or discuss with your recruiter, hey, what's your policy on discrimination? What actions are you taking? For example, if one of your therapists or healthcare providers is on assignment and an instance of discrimination or racism occurs, what are you doing about it? I think that those are some important things for us to be thinking about, some important questions to be asking.
Yeah, and you want to know if the travel company will have your back in any situation like that. So let's say that you travel to a small rural community where the manager is not inclusive and they make comments that are offensive. Like, how is a travel company going to help you out in that situation?
And one therapist went so far as to say, maybe we should be talking to our travel companies if, one, what are you going to do about it? Would you be in support of terminating that contract and removing that therapist from a bad environment? Are you going to be supportive? But even so far as, would they be willing to terminate a relationship with a facility, which I think is a big step. But some people might look at that as like, well, that would make a huge statement. If you found out that a clinic or a facility had racist beliefs or were participating in discrimination, if you not only removed that therapist from that facility, but you refused to work with them in the future. I don't know what the travel therapy companies would say to that, but it was an interesting prospect that was brought forward.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be on a case-by-case basis depending on what happened. Obviously, the travel therapy community or the travel therapy companies and the recruiters, they want to have the travelers back, but also they are profit motivated, so you have to ask those kind of questions.
Yeah, but I mean, that kind of goes back to just like the bigger issue in our country as a whole. I think a lot of people are making calls to action if a company, if an organization is racist, to boycott that organization, and this would be kind of along the same lines. Just something to think about. So something else to think about, and if there are any recruiters that are watching this, is just that it's very important for our recruiters to be sensitive to some of these cultural issues, to listen and to understand your travelers. And what really I kind of was thinking about when I was thinking about this comment I received from a colleague, I think they said something specifically like, ask your recruiter, have your recruiter ask the therapist if they've ever been discriminated against, or ask them if they've experienced discrimination and to tell them more about that. I don't know exactly how that would go, like if they would explicitly ask you that, but I do think it's important, like if we want to look at it from a different perspective, say you have a good relationship with your recruiter and you really want your recruiter to understand, like, don't present peds jobs to me because I don't have experience in peds. Like, they should understand you on a level of like, Why don't I want to go work in a pediatric clinic? Duh, I don't have experience there. Well, maybe they should also understand you and have a good relationship with you on a cultural level. Like, if you tell them that you are sensitive to matters of, like, I don't want to go to rural areas because I don't feel comfortable culturally, and they keep presenting to you rural areas, it's like, where's the disconnect here? So there's just definitely a call to action for our recruiters to be sensitive to cultural diversity and cultural issues and get to know their therapists on that level as well. And just don't be afraid to ask questions and have open and candid conversations about that.
Yeah. Something else we can recommend to travel companies is education for therapists and for their own staff on diversity, inclusiveness, and so far as things like presentations, in services, and for therapists, even like CEU. So going to a facility, maybe recommend to the manager there, some kind of diversity training for the therapist. It's usually pretty obvious when you go into one of these communities how inclusive and open they are to others.
Yeah, and I think most of the time, like when we do our standard, our HIPAA compliance and that kind of stuff, there probably usually is some type of small module or something we have to complete on cultural diversity. But I think the call to action was to have something more thorough, have something that really highlights cultural diversity, educates therapists to just do a lot of the things that we've already talked about in our self-reflection, just educating us on diversity and discrimination issues so that we could be better as a group of healthcare professionals.
Yep. So you want to go through some comments before we do the...
Yeah, so we'd like to take some comments, and then we're going to just kind of wrap up everything, give our take-home points of everything that we've talked about. So if you do have suggestions, if you have some comments that you'd like to make, if you'd like to add to the discussion, we would love to hear from you, specifically kind of in those three categories we broke down, like what do you feel like the issues are? What have you done personally, and what are some calls to action or some suggestions that you have for our community as a whole on how we can do better and how we can move our community and our country forward. So please let us know if you have those questions. We will read through the comments that we have already, and then we're going to kind of summarize everything into take-home points. Nikki said, in regards to our earlier conversation about recruiters, she said that's a great question for recruiters. Thanks, Nikki.
I think that was in regard to how to handle, or how they would handle a situation where there was discrimination in the workplace.
Tamika said, great conversation. Thank you, Tamika. I appreciate your insight. Jonathan says, it's definitely hard to speak up for anyone, but it is so important though.
Yep.
And this is coming from our friend Jonathan, who is a person of color, and he's saying that even for him, it might be difficult to speak up, but it is very important.
Yeah, it's always easier to let things slide, but that is not the best thing to do for sure. Veronica says, yes, speak up, recognize our privilege, and use it for change.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. I appreciate your insight. Hi, Nick. Hi, Anastasia. Armand says there is also body type discrimination, which is something we did not mention. He says this is a very real thing. And then he says in parentheses, take it from an old fat therapist.
Yeah, that is definitely a real thing. We've run into that for sure in different places that we've gone to, either discrimination against patients based on body type as well as therapists.
Yeah, thanks, Armand. We really appreciate your input there. Hi, Thomas. Hi, Caleb. Hi, Hannah. Hi, Aaron. Thank you guys for joining. Hey, Harris. Thank you. Hi, Lauren. Nikki. Hey, Matt. Hey, Alora. Hi, Naya. Thank you guys for joining. Hi, Tamika. Make sure we got everybody. Hey, George. Veronica said, glad you guys are having this conversation. Thank you, Veronica. Hi, John. Hi, Angela. And hey, Vanessa. Thank you guys for joining in. We'll just see if there's any more comments or suggestions, and then we will give our summary to the whole topic.
Leanne says, OTs, please visit the LGBTQIA plus network and occupational therapy Facebook to find a resource for developing your own self-awareness and do your work regarding combating white supremacy.
Thanks, Leanne, for that resource, and I'm sure there's just a multitude of resources out there. We did not compile a list, but I know they're out there. Alora says, I agree. It took me a full 24 hours to finally have the courage to speak up about my incident at work.
Yeah, I'm sure that is a very tough situation when something happens and you second guess, is it really that big of a deal? And it would be so hard to deal with. Thanks
for your feedback. Hi, Rhonda. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so we're just going to kind of give a summary of everything we talked about tonight. But, I do want to say the conversation doesn't end when the video ends. Like, please come to us if you guys have more suggestions, more insight. We really wanted to just provide a platform to just start this discussion among our community of travel healthcare providers. But the conversation doesn't end after this video. The conversation doesn't end after this week. It doesn't end after social media stops talking about current affairs. You know, we need to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing is just about awareness. There's a lot of things that we didn't realize when we started reaching out to people asking for their experience. We didn't realize some of the things that people deal with. So spreading awareness and trying to share other people's experience is very important.
Yep. So some of the take-home points from our video tonight in terms of actionable steps. We feel that it's very important that we all educate ourselves on the issues that exist within our country, but we can at least just start within our particular travel healthcare community. So educate ourselves. It's important that we are sensitive to, tongue-tied. It's important that we are sensitive to issues of cultural diversity, sensitive to issues of inclusion and discrimination.
It's very important for us to have some self-reflection on our own implicit biases. Everybody has them. It doesn't matter if you're a majority group, a minority group, everyone has biases. And to just realize what your own biases are and what level that you have those biases.
Yeah, because I think it's very important that we understand that our biases affect our interactions with not only our patients, but with our colleagues. So it's very important to kind of just self-reflect and learn. The next thing we want to bring home as a point here is we as travel healthcare professionals are in a unique position where we enter new communities all the time. So we are in a position to help spread awareness, help spread positivity, help encourage inclusivity. We are in a position to denounce racism and discrimination when we are in those new environments. I know it's not easy. It's really not easy, but we should spread the positivity and spread the light. And not just stand idly by, especially when we are in such a unique position to make a difference and make an impact. And I think we often think like, okay, we're there to make an impact on the healthcare of that community, right? Like we're there to serve the healthcare of that community, but why not also start to plant seeds, plant positive ideology in those communities as well, you know, in a positive and in a professional manner when it's appropriate.
Yeah, and another thing we need to do is support diversity among our professions. Like we mentioned, the numbers are pretty crazy in terms of how high the percentage is of PTs, OTs, and SLPs that are primarily white. It's very high. So we need those numbers to more reflect like general demographic information and not just be all white people treating patients. That's crazy. So you don't obviously want to force anyone to go into a profession they don't want to, but there are things you can do through legislation that can encourage people of minorities to go into healthcare. Yeah,
so I think a good place to start there is for us to all try to be involved with our various organizations. If you are a PT, try to be involved with your APTA, OT, the AOTA, and the speech therapists for ASHA. So trying to get involved, trying to move our professions forward in a positive light, including with diversity and reducing discrimination, we feel like is a very important thing for us to do to help improve our professions and improve our community.
Yep. I think that's all we have. Like we said, if you guys have any questions or any comments or your own experiences, feel free to post those after the video is over. Send us messages. We're always willing to share your experiences, you know, if that's something that you want us to share.
Yeah, and please don't feel any hesitation in the groups that we admin. We have our Travel Therapy Mentors community group, and then Jared also has the group more tailored to those that are interested in financial independence, the Healthcare Travelers on Fire. We openly welcome any comments, questions in terms of diversity and cultural awareness in those groups. You know, we really do encourage, try to keep these conversations positive and productive. There's enough hate spewing around on social media. We really don't need that in our community. Let's just try to keep it positive and productive and moving forward.
Yeah, focus on more of solutions, you know, like what are actionable things that we can actually do instead of just dwelling on the problems, because the problems are very important, but we need a direction to move towards to make things better.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for those that have tuned in and for those that might watch later. We hope that we did this topic justice. We hope that we helped to shed some light on some of these issues, and we tried our best to bring in a well-rounded variety of experiences and perspectives, not just that of our own. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and go out and do good in the world.
If you got value from this video, please like it. we are going to start uploading these videos as podcasts as well. So like the podcast, subscribe if you're listening to it that way.
And YouTube, we're spreading out on all the
platforms, all the Twitters. So we'll be back next
Except
week.
we're not really on Twitter.
Yeah, we're not.
That's a quote from a movie.
Yeah, I don't remember where I got that from. We're pretty much on every platform but Twitter, I guess.
Yeah.
But. All right, thanks you guys. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.